Thank you very much indeed. Master, Wardens, Your Excellencies, my Lords, Aldermen, Sheriff, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege and a great pleasure to have been invited to deliver this 26th Tacitus lecture in this amazing hall with this wonderful audience. And I'm fortunate too in two respects. One is that our hosts are the worshipful company of traders who have a central part to play in the story I'm going to tell you tonight. And secondly, that I have been introduced by Sheriff Pullman, a valued colleague of the past. My only bitter disappointment is that he's not wearing tights. I did 30 years ago. I looked at his legs and I thought, that man is born for tights. And so it's wonderful to see him having made such a distinguished contribution to this company and to the city, and I'm very grateful to him for his introduction. I'm going to suggest tonight that the UK is approaching a crossroads. In one direction lie difficult politics, an inward-facing economy, a gradual loss of competitiveness that threatens our national well-being over the long term. In the other lies a very different vision. A country which is going through hard times, certainly, and will continue to do so, but which has a sense of purpose and a determination to earn its way in the world. Open to trade and to investment and to the movement of ideas and people. A sense of long-term strategy, a global leader in innovation, a willingness to take risks in order to open new markets and to develop new products and services. All this will absolutely be necessary to revitalise the economy, which is the subject of my talk tonight. All these qualities are well within our reach, and they are all surely part of the DNA of this worshipful company of world traders. We start off from a difficult place. 5 years into what is turning into the longest period of economic depression in the United Kingdom in modern times, there is a sense of weariness in the land. The animal spirits of industry appear rather sedated, and the failure of our economy to grow means that tax revenues are well below and spending is well above what the Chancellor had been anticipating. So the necessary fiscal consolidation is running behind schedule, and we face years more of belt tightening. Productivity in our economy has fallen. Our banking system, a critically important part of a healthy economy, remains under attack and reeling from the effects of what are sometimes self-inflicted wounds. Trust in business has been damaged, and there are political divisions everywhere about our role in Europe, about immigration, about whether and how we should address the marked increase over the past 30 years in the degree of inequality in our society. And all this at a time of tremendous change in the world, in the way the world works, on a scale and at a pace that may be unprecedented in history. A massive shift of economic power to the east, much more interconnectedness everywhere, increasing pressure on resources and the environment. I'm going to suggest that to revitalise our economy in these extraordinary circumstances, we are going to need a new sense of strategic direction. On our current path, inevitably, we're heading towards 7 lost years, with output unlikely to get back to the level at the beginning of 2008 until 2015. It could take longer than that. It will leave scars on a generation of young people who've lost the habit of work, on the infrastructure of our economy, and on the pace of innovation. We must be more ambitious than that. And we can be, given strong leadership from government, industry, and the city. So my lecture tonight comes in 3 parts. The first, I'm sorry to say, is gloomy. It's about why, as I said at the beginning, the times now feel pretty hard, pretty bleak, and why we need to be thinking about perhaps a course correction. In the second part, I'll try to explain why I think we should be very confident indeed that positive change is achievable. And I'll wind up the third section with some ideas about the way forward. So let me get the gloomy bit out of the way first, if you will. The central part, the central problem, is that the necessary rebalancing of our economy away from debt-fueled government spending, debt-fueled household spending, and towards exports and private investment, that rebalancing is not yet taking place. This lies at the heart of economic strategy, and so far it's not happening. And that, I guess, is why Moody's chopped our AAA rating last week. Thinking back to the rebalancing, let's start with the trade story. There we see sterling has devalued by about a fifth since 2007, which you would have thought would power our exports higher. But instead, our performance has been disappointing. Over the past 4 years, they've only grown at about half the rate that they were growing in the years up to the crisis. It's easy to blame the problems in the Eurozone for this. And of course, the weakness in our major marketplaces is a very important part of the story. But there's more to it than that. Even allowing for the weakness, the fall of demand from the euro area, and adjusting for that, UK exports have underperformed. Despite the devaluation, manufacturing is just about holding its way in the last year or two, but we've lost market share in the volume of services exported. And that largely reflects weakness in the financial services business, which makes up about a quarter of all our trade in services. Demand from overseas markets has obviously taken a hit, but it may also be that the supply of UK financial services has fallen as financiers in the city, people in this room, have become more risk-averse, less willing to test the waters in new markets, feeling the new burdens of regulation in their domestic sphere. So there's an obvious challenge here for this company of world traders. The position grew worse in the second half of last year as sterling strengthened against the euro and our costs rose in our industries as productivity fell. So it's no surprise that sterling has come under pressure again this year, but it's a sign of weakness, certainly not a sign of strength that sterling is going down. And these problems are part of a longer-term anxiety about how Britain is going to earn its way in the world. So trade isn't providing the boost that our economy needs just yet. In fact, it's been the main weakness in it over the last 12 months. And business investment, I'm afraid, isn't a much brighter story either. It fell steeply in the wake of the banking crash by about a quarter and has hardly recovered since. It's normal for businesses to take in their horns at the time of a great economic shock, as companies seek to conserve their cash and worry about likely future levels of demand for their products and services. But business investment has fallen by a lot more in this recession, and the recession of 2008-9, than in previous ones, and it's stayed flat for longer too. And as with the export story, this is part of a longer-term trend. The OECD survey of the United Kingdom, which came out a couple of weeks ago, showed that before the recession, just before the recession, investment in fixed and intangible assets and research and all those good things in the UK was running at about 15% of our economy. In the United States, the figure was 20%. In Sweden, it was 25%. And we were particularly weak in spending on research and development. Of course, we all know that patents are a very crude way of measuring innovative success. Still, it's not cheering that none of the top 20 organizations holding patents to graphene, which is this wonder new product material developed in Manchester University, none of the top 20 is British. I'll come in a bit to why I think British businesses tend to invest less in long-term assets like plant and equipment or research than others. But the point to emphasize just for now is that business investment is not driving the economy forward in the way that it must do. In the meantime, another important component has been spluttering, and that, of course, is household spending. It was obvious after the credit bubble that we were all going to tighten our belts a bit. But in the end, things have turned out tougher than even the gloomy people expected a few years ago. Inflation ahead of target, well ahead of target, well ahead of the increases in wages. So we've had the steepest fall in living standards in nearly 90 years. You can see that in the shuttered shop windows on our high streets. And again, I think things aren't going to get a whole lot easier in the next year or two, as the Bank of England's latest projections suggest that inflation will continue to be rising above the target for a little while to come. Family debts aren't so big as they were, but they're still much higher as a share of income than they were in the 1990s. So it's no wonder that many people in the country are not exactly cheerful right now. Among other worries, they're heavily dependent on interest rates staying low. For the reasons I've mentioned, this absence of growth has made the Chancellor's job a whole lot harder than I think anybody could have anticipated when he took office in 2010. It's just taking longer. Indeed, on a like-for-like basis, it's possible that government borrowings in the year about to end will be higher in nominal terms than they were in the previous year, although the Chancellor, no doubt, will be looking under every cushion in every government department in the next weeks to try and make sure that doesn't happen. Whatever the precise final number, the deficit for this year will be running at over 7% of gross domestic product, which is well below the unprecedented levels it hit in the wake of the crash, but is still the highest in the European Union and unsustainable for any great length of time. So the Chancellor has no choice but to keep his foot on the brakes. The problem is, actually, he's already done the relatively easy bits. Most of the tax increases have already taken place that he's planned. Most of the spending in capital and infrastructure that he's planned has taken place. But most of the cuts in day-to-day spending on public services and on benefits, most of those have still to come. It's much harder to cut spending on welfare than it is on roads. And with an election looming not much more than a couple of years away, this will be a real test of the coalition government's fortitude. Of course, there is one apparently good piece of news in the headlines, which is the employment numbers. But in my gloomy mood, which I promise will pass in about 4 minutes, in my gloomy mood, I worry even about that. Because at one new level, of course, it's great that so many people are at work, earning money, paying taxes, perhaps above all, keeping the habit of the workplace. But at another level, a rise in employment at a time when the economy is roughly an eighth smaller than it would have been if it had kept on its past trend. That tells us that something pretty bad or pretty amazing is happening to productivity in the workplace. Indeed, according to the Office of National Statistics, output per hour in the UK in 2011, which is the latest figure they have, was a full 16 percentage points lower than in other industrialized economies. And this matters because, in the words of the economists, a country's ability to improve its standard of living over time depends almost entirely on its ability to raise output per worker, to increase productivity, output per hour. So are we turning into a kind of low-wage, low-productivity economy? That would be the exact opposite of where we need to be at a time when economic power is slipping away to the east. Now, of course, economists have any number of explanations for anything. If there's more than one in the room, there's going to be 17 different explanations, and there are 17 different explanations for what's happening now. I go for the rather optimistic one, which is that what the numbers show, contrary to those who think that the best way to get the economy moving is to make it easier to hire and fire people and make the labour market more efficient, these figures tell me that the labour market in this country is already extremely efficient. Employees are willing to trade low wages for employment. And at a time of so much uncertainty, companies are willing to take on and are preferring to take on more labour than they are to make the long-term commitment of investing in capital equipment. If that's correct, then this productivity weakness will turn out to be temporary. Employment will pick up when the recovery starts, and we'll see a gradual improvement in output per hour going forward. Here's hoping, anyway. But in the meantime, our economy is becoming less competitive because of this productivity question. I'll just now turn to what I promise will be the last gloomy part of my section before we get on to cheerier stuff. And that's because I want to talk about the direction and purpose of British business. I've already mentioned its relatively low commitment to long-term investment, to research and to innovation. For me, it's a rather amazing and striking fact that over a fifth of research and development that's done by businesses in the UK, over a fifth is paid for by foreign-owned companies who have located in the UK. If you look at Germany, the figure is about a quarter of that. Almost all German R&D is done by German companies. We rely heavily on foreign companies in this country to help us with our research. Over the past several decades, British investors have become increasingly unwilling to put money into research and innovation and to tie up capital in those industries that require long-term finance. Look, for example, at what's happened to our building materials industries, cement and bricks and tiles. Boring stuff, but vital to our economy, and when I started my working life, all owned by British companies. Now they're pretty well all owned. The British building materials industry is owned essentially by France, Mexico, Switzerland, and elsewhere. Consider the structure of our power generating industry, which is going to need over 100 billion of new capital over the next 10 years to keep our energy humming. It's already clear that very little of this money, very little of this capital, is going to be financed on the back of British balance sheets. The arguments about the dangers of short-termism in British business are very familiar, and I don't intend to run through them tonight, you'll be pleased to hear. But I would like to repeat, if I may, a comment made by Dominic Barton, who's the boss of McKinsey's worldwide. He said that business communities in developed economies, like the UK, have become too focused on a narrow set of objectives and meeting short-term performance expectations at the expense of long-term value creation. And there's lots of growing evidence, academic evidence, to support this assertion. One study, for example, showed that in economies like ours, which are driven by financial markets more than they are in continental Europe, there are greater pressures to make cuts in research and development, and that's part of the story here. He also argues that executives must understand that capitalism is not a zero-sum game. Businesses need to recognize that serving the interests of all their stakeholders, employees, suppliers, customers, creditors, communities, and the environment, is essential to sustaining corporate value. There are risks. We can see them in the narrow approach, which focus on the interests of shareholders more than anything else. There's a very gloomy book just published by a professor at Oxford's Said Business School, Colin Mayer. And he says, "We've entered a system of shareholder value-driven companies whose detrimental effects regulation is supposed to, but fails to correct. And in response, we seek greater regulation as the only instrument that we believe can address the problem." And this pattern must surely lie behind the problems, part of the problems of the banking sector, which in pursuit of ever higher return on shareholders' capital took ever greater risks until the system collapsed, and which now faces stifling regulation as a consequence. And the cap on bankers' bonuses, agreed last night in Brussels, is only the latest example. It will, I fear, have adverse consequences for the City of London. The same pattern also applies to explain current anxieties about the integrity of our food chain, which too inevitably faces more regulation. I hesitate to suggest that this too will be a case of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. I think it also shows why public trust in business, which has to be the main engine of economic recovery, is low today. And if we're to unleash the power of market forces to drive our economy to a better place, which we must, then we're going to have to make changes here too. We're going to have to think about the real purpose of business. And that's a job for people in this room, much more than it is for government. It's a challenge for investors and for world traders. Enough of the gloom. The point I've been trying to make so far is that the current trajectory of our economy is rather bleak. The best we appear to be able to hope for is a faltering economic recovery over a few years and a long and painful period of rebuilding our public finances. There doesn't seem to be a great sense of national purpose, of what we're trying to achieve beyond the necessary austerity. Policymaking feels more tactical than strategic. Business too often seems part of the problem rather than the essential solution. And we have to be able to do better than this. And so on to section 2 and the conviction that a course correction, if that's the right words, towards a better place is indeed possible. I think that the key to long-term success or failure of a nation, many studies have shown, lies first in the strengths of its institutions. Countries which do have strong institutions, where citizens feel that on the whole they get a fair deal, can pull through troubled times and build a platform for future recovery. Countries which don't, can't. And although we British love to complain about how badly our country is run, in relative terms and actual terms, we are very strongly placed in this respect. We are fortunate to have a head of state who is widely trusted and respected. We have a parliamentary system which we love to moan about, but which, for all its idiosyncrasies, works a lot better than most. We have the rule of law and contracts that can be counted on. Despite what you read in the newspapers, most of us pay our taxes. We have a whole series of independent agencies whose job it is, and which they succeed in doing, is to stop politicians from poking their noses where they'd better not be. Places like the Bank of England, or the competition authorities, or the regulators of privatised industries, or the Office for Budget Responsibility created by the new government. The list goes on. Our businesses constantly complain about regulation and red tape. Yet this same OECD study that I've just mentioned shows that the United Kingdom has the least restrictive product market regulation of any member state of the OECD. And the overall level of administrative regulation on their analysis is also well below average. Barriers to foreign investment in this country are low, and we get more than any other European country. In 2011, foreign direct investment in plant and factories and services creating jobs and wealth in this country came to $77 billion, much higher than for any other developed economy apart from the United States. Our science base is tremendously strong. We sometimes forget that. However you measure it, it's second only to that of the United States in most respects. And we have an unfair share of the world's best universities. It's true that our manufacturing sector has shrunk faster than that of most other industrialized countries in the past 15 years, and there are concerns about the strength of the supply chain. But we still have real pockets of global excellence in areas like aerospace, defense, life sciences, high-value precision engineering. British vehicle assembly plants, amazing to somebody of my age, we now have the most productive vehicle assembly plants in the world here in the United Kingdom. The City of London is the world's greatest capital market and a source of real economic strength. It can and must withstand the present attacks and play an even bigger role in a world where capital markets are going to be more, not less important in financing and supporting economic development. And of course, we have strong competitive advantage in a host of other sectors in the services industry, from legal services, from the sectors that so many of you are working in, through to movie animation and electronic games and a whole raft of stuff. And for all these reasons and more, the UK has been moving up the league table the league tables of competitiveness in the past few years. On the latest reading from the World Economic Forum, for example, the UK came in 8th out of 144 countries, which was two slots higher than it had been in the previous year, 4 slots higher than in 2010-11. Of course, it's true that our public finances are in a poor way, and outstanding government debt is reaching worryingly high levels when expressed as a share of the whole economy. But a point that isn't emphasised nearly enough is that all this debt, thanks to people in the city, actually, and government, this debt is brilliantly well financed. Its average maturity, the length on average of British government debt, is 14 years. Now, the other country in the European Union which comes as close to that in terms of the well-financingness of its public debt is Austria, and its maturity is 6.5 years. What this tells us is that the UK does not have to roll over its debt every 5 minutes like those countries in the southern part of the Union. And it tells us, for this and many other reasons, that it would be completely absurd to suggest that we are somehow in the same boat as those troubled countries in the Eurozone periphery. Our business sector has plenty of firepower too. Small firms are still finding credit conditions hard and tough to come by. But if you look at the whole swathe of non-financial, privately owned companies in this country, you find that together that they are holding now, and here's a number, £672 billion in cash and currency on their balance sheet, which is equivalent to more than 2/5 of the whole economy. If only they had the confidence, if they could only be encouraged to invest some of this cash mountain, the economy would soon be in a better place. And here's my final reason for optimism. Well, I've got many others, but the final one I'm going to share with you is that in the course of my ridiculously long working life, I've twice lived through periods when the long-term outlook looked bleak and Britain felt sick. In the 1970s, in the late 1970s, after the humiliation of being bailed out by the International Monetary Fund, and when trade union oligopolies seemed to rule the land, and British productivity lagged way behind its competitors. In the late 1980s, when inflation felt like a fact of life and policy errors led to another humiliating crisis in 1992. But today we don't worry. We don't have to worry anymore about overmighty trade unions or rampant inflation. We have fixed that. And in the years leading up to 2007, the long years from the early 90s, we showed we could outstrip other rich countries when it came to productivity growth, not just thanks to the strength of our financial services sector. We showed that product market competition, improvements in technology, openness to foreign business and talent, all these and other assets helped to drive up prosperity over that period. My point really is this: we've done it before, we can do it again. And so on to my final section 3, and what we might want to do now to put the economy onto a better trajectory. I should start by saying there's no easy way. But as well as strong institutions, successful nations tend to have something else in common as well. They have a sense of where they think their future wealth and jobs might come from. Not an old-fashioned kind of national plan that the Labour Party introduced way back in the 1960s, full of completely unrealistic targets and meaningless numbers. No, some kind of vision which brings government, business, the private sector and voters together with a shared sense of purpose. I visited Korea a couple of months ago, and they have been, by their standards, through a tougher period in their economy. And I was really struck by the way everybody I spoke to had this idea about a better tomorrow, about the thought that their hard work today, their sacrifices today, would create opportunities for them and their children tomorrow. Countries like Singapore, Israel, Finland, they have these same similar sort of can-do attitudes. Austerity is not enough. Most people don't get out of bed in the morning to defend the company's AAA credit rating. Our coalition government talks a lot about growth and has launched all sorts of initiatives, some of them impressive, in an effort to stir it up. But I think it's hard to spot an overarching strategy for the future, clear enough to make business investment rise and clear enough to set goals for society more generally. In the struggle to meet our fiscal objectives, there is a risk that these longer-term possibilities might get pushed to one side. Nesta, which is the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, produced, I thought, a really good paper a few months ago. And they said it's time to stop going on about Plan A or Plan B and all that stuff. Let's talk about Plan I, which is the case for innovation-led growth. Innovation drove nearly two-thirds of the UK's productivity growth in the last decade. Innovative firms create more jobs, build more wealth, export more goods and services than the rest. In the globalizing world, innovation is the key to competitive advantage and rising standards of living. And government has a central part to play. It's not enough for government to create the right macroeconomic environment and then get out of the way. Government has to play a part. We know that the United States is a champion of free markets. Yet, according to a recent analysis, 77 of the 88 most important US innovations over the past 35 years were found to have been fully dependent on federal support, government support, especially but not only in their early years. The algorithm, the kind of secret magic ingredient that made the Google search engine as successful as it is, was initially funded with federal money. And as well as finance, many of the basic elements of successful innovation systems are also shaped by government, whether it's the provision of education and skills, research capabilities, infrastructure, or technological specialization. Innovative success is built around kind of complex systems which sometimes have to combine freewheeling entrepreneurs, lively startup cultures with state support, flair with disciplined implementation, speculation with hard graft. And the state has a role to play in this. And I think somewhere here lies the vision which can help us through these difficult times. And I think this is where we need to be thinking about tweaking our policies somewhat. Countries like Germany and Korea, many of which already invested more in research and innovation than we did before the financial crisis, rapidly scaled up their investments in this area as part of their recovery plans. The UK, to its credit, ring-fenced its research budgets, but in contrast to these other big economies, its overall spending on research and development was lower in the last year than it was 6 years earlier. And the other components of innovation have also been squeezed in the last year or three. The business sector has done the same, also from a comparatively low base. The Nesta numbers suggest that innovation investment fell 5% in the first year of the crisis and has continued to slide ever since. The UK financial system does not, for the most part, finance innovation, doesn't finance startup innovation in British businesses. And an analysis by the Department of Business shows that the credit crunch has tended to penalise our most innovative firms. We need to reverse these trends. Of course, public spending has to be constrained, but it must be done in an intelligent way. Just as it's wrong to saddle future generations with heavy burdens of government debt, so it's wrong to deprive them of economic opportunities by channeling government spending into current consumption as opposed to productive investment for the future. Increased current spending adds to the debt that has to be financed by future taxpayers. But in investing in an asset which will create an economic return greater than the cost, creates a public asset which will add to, rather than subtract from, the income of future generations. It's surely time for the Treasury to differentiate between the two. We should be reprioritising public spending, giving greater weight and support to investment in areas that will help to build our future well-being. I'm absolutely not arguing for some great stimulus package which would send the bond markets into a tizzy. But a credible innovation policy, which I'm suggesting is what we need, will need to be backed up by resources. We need a new business bank, larger than the one that is currently being discussed in the Department of Business, to support those innovative firms and bring greater competition to a retail banking sector which is more heavily concentrated among a handful of very large banks than in any other advanced economy. We need to attract talented researchers and innovators from around the world, something which the current immigration policy is making especially difficult. We need public investment in technology infrastructure and support for early-stage growth businesses. And we need to do more to support innovation in our small and medium-sized enterprises. Going back to my favourite OECD report that showed in 2009, SMEs in this country received by far the lowest level of support for R&D in the whole of the OECD. The coalition government has taken steps to put this right, which is good, and it could do more. But we won't build a world-class innovation system just through government intervention. It's going to take full-hearted support from industry, from traders, and from the city more generally. What's it going to take to persuade industrialists and financiers to adopt a longer-term view, to invest in products and services that might take more than a few years to pay back? Maybe the government could do more to encourage them. I'd be interested, for example, to hear your views about skewing the corporate tax system, the tax that companies pay, in order to make it much more attractive for them to invest their after-tax profits today rather than hanging on to them for the future. About changing the accounting rules so that the real cost to continuing shareholders of expensive share buybacks is reflected in the accounts. About rebalancing the structure of shareholder voting, perhaps, so that those who had held shares in a company for years had a bigger say in its future than those who'd only held the shares for a couple of days. But in order to really to unleash the forces of the market economy, strong leadership will have to come from the city and from industry, from the people in this room. They and you will need to work with government to develop a vision of an innovative future that the public will be ready to buy into. That consensus on that is necessary, because investing for the future requires making sacrifices today. And I think this, in turn, is going to call for a change in the mindset of our business leaders and of those investors who have the ultimate power of hiring and firing them. These leaders need to rebuild public trust in business and show by their actions that business lies at the heart of a healthy society as opposed to being a rapacious outsider. They need to stop their quarter-by-quarter earnings focus and recognize that successful business is about building long-term value for customers, and that profit is a means to an end, creating better products and services, not an end in itself. In other words, they must act more like owners, less like temporary agents, to take a stewardship role and to think about ethics as well as about earnings. Now, people have been banging on about these thoughts for years, so my question is, why should anything change? I'm hopeful for a number of reasons. First, if we've learned anything in the last few years about the economy, it's surely been that there are limits to what markets can do. Businesses don't operate in a parallel universe where anything goes. They do need to be part of the communities in which they operate. Second, businesses have to recognize that the public mood has changed. 5 years ago, company boards were asking their finance directors why the company didn't relocate to Dublin for tax reasons. Today, they're much more likely to be asking the same luckless finance director about the risks of dodgy tax arrangements that might get them up before a select committee in the House of Commons. Third, companies that did take the longer-term view, by and large, came through these hard times better than those that didn't. Think of those firms in the German Mittelstand that have stuck to their knitting for years and have helped to turn their country into the world's most successful exporter. They think about shareholder value, but in terms of future generations, not in terms of today. A number of great companies in the United Kingdom are now moving in this direction, and one can see that number growing. Fourth, it's become increasingly clear that the idea that businesses exist primarily to maximize shareholder value, that idea leads to a dead end. To go back to Professor Mayo's words, the pursuit of ever narrower shareholder interest leads inevitably to more intrusive and ultimately ineffective regulation, crushing the life out of entrepreneurial spirit. And my fifth reason for being optimistic is that as global economic power shifts to east, it's absolutely obvious that the winners will be the innovators. And there's no more striking example of this than Apple, the most successful and the most innovative company in the world. So I'm hopeful. Nearly 8 years ago now, Britain won the contest to stage the 2012 Olympic Games. Right up to the last minute, there were those who said we couldn't hack it. But the nation had a vision of what could be achieved. This big idea had cross-party political support that was sustained unscathed through a change of government. It attracted brilliant managers and our most creative minds. It inspired a whole generation of British athletes to near superhuman efforts. It pulled in armies of cheerful volunteers, which were, weren't they, in many ways, the most inspiring feature of the whole thing. And it turned out to be a triumph. What we need now, I think, is a similar vision of a country that can and will get through hard times and deliver an innovative future that will raise living standards and create new opportunities. And I think it's up to our leaders in government, industry, and the city to deliver this vision now. Thank you very much.